Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Subversive History. Today, we are joined by Shir Hever. Shir is an independent economic researcher, a manager of the Alliance for Justice Between Israelis and Palestinians, and also a coordinator for the Boycott National Committee campaign seeking a military embargo on the state of Israel. He has also written numerous books focusing on Israel's occupation of Palestine and other related topics. If you've been following our channel, you would know that we have interviewed a number of Israeli academics, including Avi Schleim, Ilan Pape, and recently, it hasn't been released yet, but we interviewed Neve Gordon, who I know that sure you've cited several times throughout your books. So I'm very happy that we were able to contribute to our discourse on this topic with more people that are in these academic fields. And sure, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me back.
So, in the preface to your book, The Political Economy of Israel's Occupation, you describe a transformative moment you experienced. And I feel like this moment serves as an appropriate jumping off point for our conversation. To quote you, as the 1990s passed, reality gave me a hard slap in the face, and my twofold belief in the free market and the peace process was shattered. Obviously, referring to the peace process between Israel and Palestine.
The Oslo peace process, yeah.
Yeah. Can you describe this pivotal moment in your life and what you experienced that altered your perspective so profoundly moving forward?
Well, because it's a very biographical point that you're bringing up, I should clarify that I was a teenager during the 90s. So that was a time in which going to high school and getting a very militarized version of the news and education at an Israeli school. Obviously, I was told by my educators, by the newspapers I read every morning, that Israel is now headed towards peace, that Palestinians should be grateful for the generosity offered to them by the Rabin government. All that, and this Rabin government has, at the same time, it worked very hard to dismantle the last remnants of the Israeli social support network, and also not to end the occupation, as I thought they were trying to do, but rather privatize the occupation. Mm-hmm. Turn it into a subcontractor agreement with the Palestinian Authority so that somebody else will do the dirty work.
Right.
And Yitzhak Rabin said famously to his own cabinet that they need somebody to create order in the occupied territory, but without the interference of human rights organizations and the Supreme Court. And this was what he envisioned with the Oslo agreements. And of course, Palestinians saw it very differently. And just because I come from a leftist family and my parents were also conveying to me like how they were experiencing the news and these developments, then I went along the path of being very naive and very hopeful that now the occupation will end and there will be peace, and realizing that it's not the case. And actually, only after I graduated from high school and served for a year as a kind of social service thing, which I did to do volunteer work, and gave me time to decide not to go to the military. So I didn't serve in the military. Only then I started to go to university, and only then I started to actually meet Palestinians on a daily basis, which really sunk in how deep the apartheid system really is, that I could go through the first 18 years of my life without having any meaningful interaction with Palestinians. In a country in which Palestinians, back then they were not the majority, but almost, but now they are the majority. So it was like, almost 50%, and now it's just above 50%. And only then I realized that this is not just about the occupation, the 67 occupation. It goes deeper than this. There's the Nakba, there is the ethnic cleansing and the apartheid system, which is in the entire state of Palestine. And this is a topic that you've been covering with your other guests, so I don't need to cover everything.
Okay. So just to kind of, because I do think it's important for people that are just maybe being exposed to your perspectives and things like that. I think that the biographical introduction is important to establish that. And there is some things, would you say that like prior to this kind of awakening that you're describing, that you were kind of like of a liberal Zionist mindset?
Yeah. I mean, my whole family was.
Okay. Okay.
The
Yeah.
whole family would certainly be considered to be a liberal Zionist family, voting for this liberal Zionist parties. I didn't have the right to vote yet.
Right.
So yes, and I remember this very specific evening at the family dinner table in which the family stopped being Zionist. Because it was when the Rabin government expelled 400 Palestinians without a trial, accusing them of being Hamas members without any evidence whatsoever,
Right.
and throwing them into Lebanon without any also kind of coordination with the Lebanese government. So basically, they were just thrown out, and with the expectation that the Lebanese government will take care of them.
Yeah.
And the liberal Zionist party in the Israeli Knesset, the Israeli parliament, then gave a press conference. And the journalist asked, how could you vote in favor of such an action, which is clearly undemocratic and against every law? And the answer was, well, we know things you don't know.
Mm.
So my parents, like seeing this, well, they said, well, we can never vote for this party again.
Right.
So in this sense, I'm also very privileged that I had the opportunity to go through this process and to see this in real time without actually having to,
Participate.
have regrets, for being on the wrong side of history.
Right. There's also a moment that you mention in the preface to the book that I was referring to, where after having this awakening and getting a little bit more involved in like activism and things like that while living in Israel, you mentioned a time where you found yourself staring down the barrel of a gun and being beaten by Israeli soldiers. Can you talk about that experience a little bit and how that played into this ideological development?
I'm not sure where you're getting exactly that point, because the way that you're framing it, it makes it seem like I've been, victimized. That's not what happened. Sure,
Okay.
I went to demonstrations in the occupied territory against the settlements, against the occupation, and the police and also the military were very violent and aggressive towards the demonstrators. But of course, the aggression was different to people of different skin color, and always as a Jewish Israeli citizen, also Ashkenazi. That's also important to say, because you had Avi Shleim, for example, who's not Ashkenazi,
Right.
it was Mizrahi. So yeah, I was never the victim of the full brunt of aggression that
Okay.
Palestinians have to live with every day. And the one time that I did stare down the barrel of a gun, which of course was a scary moment,
Right.
but it was my choice, because I was at part of a demonstration, and there were Palestinian children who were part of the demonstration. And when the Israelis started to throw stun grenades and tear gas grenades at the demonstration, people ran away for cover. And some children who didn't know better, I'm very small children, like 5-year-olds, I think, who were maybe 200 meters away from the soldiers, so quite a way, wanted to throw stones at the soldiers. And again, we're talking about 5-year-olds. They were
Right.
throwing pebbles, which could go maybe, I don't know, 4 meters.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So there was absolutely no hint of danger to the soldiers. But for the soldiers, this was their opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they were taking out their guns and aiming straight at the children. And 200 meters is certainly not a safe distance to stand in front of a rifle.
Right.
And then what I did, I stood in front of the soldiers, right in front of their faces. And they were shouting at me and cursing at me, but it was clear to me and to them that they're not going to shoot. So yeah, I did. It was scary staring down the barrel of a gun, but let's put it in that context, right? No, nobody shot me.
No, and I appreciate you putting that into that perspective as well, that it's like, this is not, I want to make it clear that this isn't analogous to what a Palestinian experience is when a gun is put into their face involuntarily. They didn't choose this. They're living under occupation. I stepped in front of that gun. So I don't want to be framed as a victim, like I was somehow comparable to what I appreciate you adding that context.
Yeah, and not to make it sound as if I was trying to take a bullet for these children.
Right.
Because, I knew that
you knew that they weren't going to shoot. Yeah, they weren't going to shoot an Ashkenazi Jewish man from.
Yeah.
One more question just about you personally, and that is, after you had this development and you were living in Israel, how did your life change when you adopted a more anti-Zionist perspective? Because I know we interviewed Elon Pape. He lives in England. We interviewed Avi Schleim. He lives in England. We interviewed Neve Gordon. He lived in England. And each of these describe certain scenarios where they felt that it wasn't necessarily safe or accommodating for them to live in the state of Israel anymore because of their changed perspectives and certain threats and abuses that they received. I know you no longer live in Israel. And
I live in Germany now. Yeah.
yes, yeah,
So it's not a coincidence that all of us have
yeah,
left at one point or another. I mean, these are this list of people that you mentioned are very dear to me. You know,
yeah,
I
yeah.
really like them very much as human beings. The difference
Also,
between us is mostly a generational difference. So the moment in which they experience repression in Israel is different and different consequences. And for me, the moment in which I became an adult and started my university studies and was also the moment in which the Second Intifada started. So I felt a very strong urge to be very active politically and to do everything I can, which never felt that it was enough. But the Second Intifada was a very different moment than what we're seeing today happening in Israel. So I should, again, sorry for bringing up this issue of privilege again and again, but this is what it is. It still was a moment in which I could talk about war crimes. I could talk about all these things that Israel is doing, the killing of children intentionally, the killing of unarmed demonstrators, the destruction of the Palestinian economy. These things are experienced in a daily basis. And I could talk about it. And the response that I got from Israelis around me was shame, fear, confusion. They would often start by maybe being angry and trying to silence me, but they couldn't because I was speaking from a position of privilege. So I had Palestinian friends. I'm talking also about Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship. So technically they were supposed to be with equal rights to me, but they were not. They did not enjoy equal rights, and they were not able to speak up in public against these atrocities. And they were severely punished and silenced and lost their job opportunities and so on. And I didn't. I could speak, and I can quote an Israeli member of parliament, Ahmed Tibi, who said at the time, Israel is a Jewish and democratic state in the sense that it's democratic for its Jewish citizens and a Jewish state for its Arab citizens. So I mean, it's a nice quote, but of course, a state cannot be democratic for one ethnic or religious group within the population. Then it's not really a democracy. It's an apartheid state. But this is the situation that actually made it very difficult for me to leave Israel, because I knew that my life is comfortable and convenient, and I could openly talk about my opinions and my work and my research, and I had a job, and I had friends, and it wasn't a problem. But I knew that this is not a sustainable situation. And when I talked to my friends who are still living there, including the Jewish Ashkenazi friends, now the privilege is not what it used to be. And now I really tell my friends, be very careful about what you say in public, because the repression is now unprecedented, even towards Jews.
Okay. All right. And so I know when we were having our email conversation, I wasn't aware of some of your more current work. I was looking more at the books that you had published, your work on the economics of the occupation, the privatization of the military. But you made it very clear in the emails that what you're currently involved in is being part of the Boycott National Committee campaign that is seeking to military embargo the state of Israel for its crimes that it's committing in the Gaza Strip. Can you just explain what that organization is? And obviously I gave a very simple introduction, but I think you're more qualified to describe it. So if you would just let everyone listening know what exactly that organization is and what you're aiming to do.
Yeah, I think that most people heard about BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions Movement, which is the Palestinian civil society call to boycott Israel, to divest from Israeli companies and also international companies that profit from the occupation and other Israeli crimes, and imposing sanctions. It's not just about the atrocities in Gaza. It's not just about the genocide. The BDS movement was started in 2005.
Right.
And in 2005, it had three clear goals, which were to end the occupation, to end the apartheid system, and to recognize the right of return of the Palestinian refugees. Which means, so these are, this is the movement, which predates the genocide. And the BNC is the steering committee, so to speak, of the BDS movement, because it's a movement of millions of people. And the BNC has been selected by the Palestinian civil society organizations that started the BDS movement as an organization that creates guidelines and creates social media work and promotes the BDS movement and coordinates between all the groups. So my role as the coordinator of the military embargo campaign is to coordinate all of the many groups that are working to achieve military embargo in different ways in different countries, and to make sure that they work with each other. So to share the knowledge, to share the research, to promote each other's work, and to trace also how the weapons are being delivered. So,
Right.
the U.S. is the biggest, the country that provides most of the weapons
Right.
that Israel is using, but the weapons are not usually delivered directly from the United States to Israel. They go through other countries in between. There are parts that come from other countries. So this whole supply chain is something where we can stop the weapons, and this is my job.
Okay. So I think when a lot of people hear about the BDS movement, like, and I know this for me personally, when you hear about BDS, you kind of think of it as this individual choice, like, oh, as an individual, I'm not going to go buy a Coca-Cola because I've heard that that's on the BDS list. I think many people look at it as just like this, what you do as an individual consumer. But can you kind of speak to the broader, how international law plays into the military embargo?
Yeah, of course. But if you want to have a guest that will really talk about the BDS movement as a whole, I can recommend excellent people from,
Please.
especially Palestinians who are part of the BDS movement.
Please.
We
Just to
can.
throw it out, what should I, what word is it? We've been extremely upset that we haven't been able to get as many Palestinian people to come on here and speak. And it's not for lack of trying. I think a lot of the bigger name ones are a little bit busier and things like that. And then also there just seems to be a difficulty. So we've been reaching out to a lot of Israeli academics, but we would love to get more Palestinian voices on here. So any recommendations that you have, you can shoot me an email. We would absolutely love to coordinate with you.
I absolutely will.
Okay.
But my angle that I could maybe best answer your question is not about the consumer boycott of like things like Coca-Cola, but rather how it goes to the military embargo, because we're not as individuals consuming military goods usually. And even if we do, the point of the military embargo is not to buy a handgun. It's
right.
about
stopping
the bombs and the tanks and the jet planes and
exactly.
These are and the way to do this is not by individual action, but by collective action, of course. As individuals, I think people should think about how they consume and what is the impact of this. But you cannot start a successful campaign individually. And if you think, well, this particular company is evil, this particular company, I'm not comfortable buying their product, then of course don't buy their product. But the company will not know why you have chosen not to buy their products. If you're part of a movement, if you're part of an organization that is calling for a boycott, then you have a campaign going, and then the company will absolutely know why people are not buying their products and how they're impacted by this. McDonald's, which at the beginning of the genocide decided to give free meals to Israeli soldiers who are on their way to Gaza to kill people.
Right.
And as a result, there was a grassroots demand to boycott McDonald's. And it's organized and coordinated with the BDS campaign. So McDonald's absolutely knows why people are boycotting them.
Right.
And they tried to minimize the damage by saying that they will sell the franchise in Israel to another company, but it's still branded as McDonald's. So the boycott is going on. So this shows how it works.
Okay.
Now, getting back to the military embargo, you asked me about international law.
Yes.
We have so many different international treaties and decisions that if I list them all, we'll run out of time for the interview.
Right.
Let me just focus on two decisions of the International Criminal Court of Justice in The Hague, which really speaks for humanity and for international law. And there are two different cases against Israel. One is the case that was launched at the end of December 2023, which is the genocide case.
Right.
South Africa accused Israel of genocide, and already on January 26, 2024, so just 1 month after the case was started, the court said that it orders Israel to cease acts under Article 2 of the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And these acts under Article 2 include killing members of the targeted group, which means the Palestinians in Gaza. The court made it very clear. And preventing them the basic conditions they need to live: food, water, medical services, exactly what Israel is doing. Israel is violating all of these orders. And as a result, the military embargo is really an obligation. Any country that is willing to sell weapons to Israel or dual-use items that can be used in a military way, such as energy items, coal, oil. Every country that is doing that is becoming complicit with the crimes committed by Israel. This is simply forbidden. Mm-hmm. And also, there is an obligation for the workers, for the unions, for all the people who are actually doing it in practice, to refuse to participate in those actions. And in some cases, unions who said, we're not going to unload this ship, or we're not going to fuel this ship, we're not going to allow this plane to fly to Israel carrying these weapons, these union members were not punished because they were following the law.
Right.
It's the governments who are breaking the law. So that's one court of that decision of the ICJ. The second one is from July 19th of last year, where 2024, in which the court said, this is not about the genocide, this is about the occupation. The court said the occupation as a whole is illegal.
Yeah.
And every company that is involved in the occupation, profiting from the occupation, this includes all of Israel's arms companies, of course, because they provide the tool to oppress the population, which makes the occupation possible, to control and kill the population. All these companies must be boycotted. So this is really a court decision that makes BDS, BDS has always followed the principle of imposing international law, and the demands of BDS have always been in accordance to the demands of international law. But now it's really spelled out that governments and corporations have the responsibility and the obligation to do so. And so I hope that's an answer.
Absolutely. And there's been some movement on this, right? I read on the website, and I'm just going to read it out here. On April 5th, the UN Human Rights Council, and I assume that means April 5th, 2025, just about a month or so ago.
No, 2024. The Human Rights Council is 1 year ago. Yeah.
Okay. On April 5th, the UN Human Rights Council adopted a resolution with a majority of 28 against 6, calling for a military embargo against Israel. The exact thing that you're campaigning for. The UN passed a resolution 28-6 calling for it. I guess what my question
This is the Human Rights Council,
yes,
which is not the General Assembly.
Right, and it's not the Security Council.
But in addition to this, the General Assembly also passed a resolution in September 18th, 2024, which adopted the decision of the International Court of Justice and called for sanctions on Israel until the occupation ends.
And I don't want to sound bleak or pessimistic when I ask this question, but we hear about these resolutions. We hear about them getting adopted. We hear about the sanctions. We hear about the genocide case from South Africa. We hear from the ICC that Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant are war criminals wanted by The Hague. But we still see the genocide not only continuing, but becoming more and more intense. For like the average observer, such as myself, you start to question the efficacy of international institutions and the liberal world order and things like this, because we hear about all these developments in the international institutions, but we don't see a material change on the ground for the people in Gaza or in the West Bank. So I guess my question to you is, like, what is the actionability of these decisions of these international institutions, and are they losing their efficacy? Are we transitioning away from this liberal world order? Like, what are the implications of all of this? Because we hear so much going on, but see so little actually coming from it.
Well, the frustration and the pessimism are understandable.
Right.
And of course, we have to acknowledge that
Yeah.
we are living through very dark times in this world, and we can't ignore that. But first of all, we're not allowed to allow this despair to dictate our actions.
Right.
No matter how things might look bleak, we have an obligation to act,
Mm-hmm.
and we can never succeed from a position of losing hope. We need the hope also to guide us into victory. So this is, of course, something that we need to say from the outset. Now, it is true that international law, or the law-based order, the rules-based order, which was established after World War II,
Mm-hmm.
is in jeopardy, is in a moment of crisis. That is also very clear. The country which is the one that is the reason that international law exists in the world is Germany. And Germany is violating the law.
Right.
I'm speaking to you from Germany, and the German government is knowingly violating international law by supporting Israel and selling weapons to Israel. And when activists in Germany, especially Palestinian activists, but not only, are raising their voices and saying this is not acceptable and Germany has to abide by international law, the German government responds by extreme oppression and throwing people to jail and surveilling them with the secret police, and things that are very concerning when it's the country that was supposed to which created the atrocities, the genocide of the Holocaust, because and made the need so obvious for international law in the first place. But now let's go back to your question about Gaza, because how does that mean that all of the campaigns that we're launching and for years, and all of these groups around the world, they have tremendous successes in terms of being able to stop a lot of weapons, in order to change government positions. Israel has never faced more sanctions in its history as it's facing right now.
Mm-hmm.
Israel has never faced a bigger economic crisis as it is facing right now, and certainly not a bigger diplomatic crisis than it is facing right now. But then we look at what's happening in Gaza, and we see the things that I don't even want to list them, because I don't think that we should turn this into a kind of a pornography of suffering. But there is tremendous suffering,
mm-hmm.
and there are certain violations of international law and crimes against humanity on a daily basis. Is that because Israel is strong? I think no. I think it's because Israel is weak. I think it's because the Israeli government doesn't see a way out. The Israeli public doesn't see a way out of their situation. They know that they've crossed the red line. They know that if they now say something like, oh, let's now sign a ceasefire agreement, withdraw the soldiers from Gaza, and let's go just back to how things were.
Status quo, yeah.
Yeah, before 2023, then it's not going to work. It's not, I mean, there will be a massive reckoning. So according to recent polls in Israel, a large majority of the Israeli public, including those liberal Zionists, which are supposed to be left, or at least have this reputation, are saying that they are in favor of the entire population of Gaza to be exterminated or expelled. But I think that the reason that they're saying this is not just their genocidal bloodlust and the desire for revenge, which did exist very strongly, but now we're 20 months into the genocide, and it's no longer that driving force. It's now more and more the desire to erase the evidence. They don't want to leave survivors who will talk about what happened, and they're hoping that if they somehow erase the evidence, the world will forget what happened. The world will not forget.
Mm-hmm.
This is clear. The world will not forget. And if you're reading the news in English about what's happening, it does seem very, very bleak. But I read the news also in Hebrew every day. And the news in Hebrew are a state of despair which is much, much deeper than the despair that you've been describing in your question, in the sense that there is no perspective for the future. If the Israeli Minister of Foreign Affairs, Gideon Sa'ar, just said a couple of days ago that if there would be a military embargo against Israel, I mean, or let's put it this in slightly other words, if the military embargo is not lifted, I mean, because the only two countries that are completely ignoring the military embargo are the United States and Germany, and that's not enough to meet the demand for weapons in Israel. So he's saying if this doesn't happen, then Israel will be destroyed. These are his words. So how many Israelis think that the military embargo is going to be lifted? In fact, the Israeli government itself doesn't believe the military embargo is going to be lifted because they allocate a budget to try to produce all the weapons domestically and go around importing them, which is not possible. They don't have the materials even. They have to import. But they're willing to spend tens of billions of dollars, which they don't have, to make the weapons, which they're not able to import, because they believe that if they don't, then the state will no longer exist. So bottom line, they don't see a future for their own state. So they're buying time. They're trying to kill as many people as they can. There are very religious, fanatic members of the government who believe that maybe the Messiah will come and save them. Or maybe Trump is the Messiah. That's also one interpretation that some people have. And now they're a little bit horrified that Trump doesn't seem to be following their playbook, but following his own playbook. So this is my answer to you of why we should really not lose hope.
Right. So you brought something up there, and it was kind of like the economic precarity of the state of Israel, just kind of like the nature of how it exists in terms of aid and imports and exports and things like that. So speaking on that economic precarity, can you describe how effective the BDS movement can be, particularly to Israel in a military sense and a broader economic sense?
Yeah, the BDS movement has never called for damaging the Israeli economy. That has never been a goal of the BDS movement. The point of the BDS movement was to impose the law and to impose sanctions until Israel meets international law. But it wasn't like stopping imports from Israel, for example, has never been a goal unto itself. It's a form of pressure to force Israel to comply with the law. And the assumption was that, also my assumption, let me talk about my own mistakes. My mistake was to believe that the Israelis, who really care about their standard of living and about their wealth and about their what kind of country they will leave to their children, would be pressured by this kind of threat to accept international law and to accept human rights and to accept that Palestinians are human beings with equal rights, as a way to ensure their standard of living and to make sure that they can still import and export and trade and prosper. And this didn't happen. And I think one of the reasons that it didn't happen is that the key people who were holding this position and saying that the standard of living, the economic prosperity is more important than ideas of nationalism or religion and or racism, those people left Israel in large numbers. And not all of them, but the majority of them left. And those who remain tend to be more of the fanatical, genocidal and fascist, really, parts of society, who are saying, yes, we are willing to make tremendous sacrifices. So this is in some way already an effect of BDS, I think, because those people who said we are not willing to make those sacrifices, we want to live a good life, and we see that the BDS movement is successful in growing momentum and growing strength and is able to affect the decisions of large corporations. I can give you a list of large corporations that acted based on pressure from BDS. to end all trade with Israel or to make strong statements that they will not work in the occupied territory. And then it made it impossible anyway to work with Israel, because it's always a condition that Israel makes. Either you work with the settlements or you don't have a foothold at all. So those people who saw this happening and saw BDS going strong and saying, oh, well, the Israeli government is not going to compromise, I better take my family and go and live somewhere else.
Right.
Because otherwise I will have to pay a price. So that did happen. And those who see the BDS movement growing and their response to this is, we don't need the world, we are self-sustaining, we can do everything on our own, they're wrong. They're very, very wrong, just from a simple physical, material
Right.
reason.
Yeah.
But they don't know that they're wrong yet. And as long as they continue to think that somehow God is on their side and they might turn defeat into victory, they continue to be so brutally aggressive. But I just gave the example of Gideon Sa'ar, the Israeli Minister of Foreign Affairs. So he's one of those right-wing fascists. And now he himself is acknowledging that it's not working, that Israel cannot be self-sustaining with weapons. They need to import weapons. There is a military embargo. And without it, and if Israel cannot get rid of the military embargo, Israel won't exist. So eventually, even those fanatics get converted.
Got it. So you had been mentioning a lot about like the economics of the, you've written a ton on the economics of the occupation, and I know that one of your books that I had read, it kind of tackles this question of what is the economic purpose of the occupation? Is it purely an exploitative measure so that the Israeli state can get more and more resources for economic gain? But you point to the fact that actually the occupation persists despite the economic situation, that it's actually more of a drain on the Israeli economy to continue this occupation. But you had also said in the emails between us that since October 7th, many of the things that you had written about previously have kind of been turned on their head. And I'm just curious if maybe you could speak to these economic transformations that have come since October 7th as it relates to the occupation.
Sure. Okay, well, I don't really write about the economics of the occupation. I write about the political economy. And
Sure.
the difference is that economics, being a rather conservative field of study in universities, very capitalist, very mainstream way of looking at economic structures, their assumption is that human beings are rational, and their rationality is manifested in the fact that they will always put the material interest above everything else, which I don't think is rational at all.
Right.
But this is how economists are trained to think and to research. So my argument was exactly that, no, this doesn't explain the Israeli society, because a lot of Israeli economists who do economics, conservative economists, are saying the occupation is not a rational choice. Israel would make more money if there would be a separate Palestinian state, and if the settlements would be dismantled. That's something that is almost a consensus among Israeli economists, and yet that has never been able to be translated into government policy. So the same governments who are happy to hear the economists when they talk about privatization and cutting welfare and lowering taxes and trickle-down economics and all that stuff, all that right-wing stuff that you know well from the United States, is something that they stop when these same economists are saying, oh, and also dismantle the settlements and end occupation. No, that's where the rationality stops. My argument has been that there are other forms of capital, other forms of other interests, other priorities, where people say that living in an apartheid system in which their identity has more value just because they happen to be Jewish has value to them, for which they're willing to also accept a lower standard of living, less material wealth. And this is especially true for the lower socioeconomic parts in the Israeli society, in the Jewish Israeli society, people who
Right.
are not going to get out of the working class. They don't believe that if they just work hard enough, then somehow they will become capitalists. That's not how the world works.
Right.
However, in an apartheid system, it doesn't matter if they are um, struggling just to keep themselves above the poverty line, or even if they're not above the poverty line, and it's hard for them to have a material prosperity, but they are still the upper class just by the fact that they are Jewish.
Right.
So that's valuable to them, and they're willing to support that.
Okay.
And for that, they do need occupation. They do need the settlements. They do need this constant oppression of other people who are not Jewish. This has been my main argument in my first book. But when I told you in the email that I think that a lot of what I research has been turned upside down, I referred mostly to the second book, actually, because my second book is about the relationship between the Israeli civilian society, or like the general society, the government, and the economic branches, to the military and the security sectors. How do they see these? And over the years, the non-military part of society became stronger. And in fact, it was Netanyahu himself, who is now the Prime Minister of Israel, but he has been the Prime Minister for a very long time.
Yeah.
And he fought against the generals. He's the first Israeli politician who was able to stand up against the generals. And when they said, we have strategic priorities, and you have to do this and that in order to make Israel militarily stronger, he said, I have other priorities. I would buy submarines from Germany that the generals don't need and they don't want them, but I still want the submarines from Germany because there's political value in this, because there's a bribe being paid by the German company. So these are reasons that the generals didn't like very much. And he won. He got these submarines, and there were many similar cases.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a process of privatizing security. This was a process of turning the private arms companies into for-profit companies, where they were saying, let's have a limited attack on Gaza, kill a few hundred people, and so we can market the weapons that we've been using in Gaza as successful and powerful weapons. But the last thing they wanted is a 20-month war dragging on, in which actually the weapons that the Israeli military is using in Gaza are mostly US weapons and not Israeli weapons. The Israeli companies are they don't have as many opportunities to market. And they cannot say that these weapons are effective because Israel is not winning. Like, what are the strategic objectives of Israel at all? Nobody knows. So you can't
get back the hostages and eliminate Hamas, neither of which has transpired by this point.
Yeah, well, most of the Israeli hostages were killed by the Israeli military, not on purpose, but by mistake, because they are carpet bombing.
Yes.
So they're not using the right weapons to achieve those goals, right? And they haven't destroyed Hamas, so no, they haven't achieved anything.
Right. Exactly.
Their weapons are not. They're not using the right weapons. I don't know if there are right weapons for. I don't believe that you can achieve political goals with weapons. Period. But this logic of the Israeli military and the Israeli arms companies has collapsed. And what we're seeing now is a reversal, where the arms companies are now no longer acting like private for-profit companies anymore. They're acting like branches of the government. They're no longer saying, we are developing the weapons that will bring us a lot of profit and a lot of money to the Israeli economy. Instead, they're saying, we are defending the borders. We are defending the nation. This is not the language you usually hear from a private company.
Right.
So that's an opposite trend to the trend of privatization. That's what I meant when I said things have turned on their head.
I see what you're saying. You had made a point there that you say that many Israeli economists agree essentially unanimously that the most viable economic, or that it would be better to end the occupation and have a separate Palestinian state. However, in your book, and I found this really interesting because I never heard this perspective before, you talk about the economic implications of a two-state solution versus a one-state solution. And I think your economic critique of a two-state solution is really, really interesting and powerful, because you brought up the precedent that was set from the settlements that were in Gaza that were taken down, and you brought up the compensation that was given to the settlers that were forced to leave the settlements. And you brought up how much it would potentially cost Israel if they wanted to actually enact a reasonable, as reasonable as it could be, two-state solution. There are so many settlers that would have to get compensation that I think you said that it would be billions of euros to actually adequately pull that off, and it would essentially bankrupt the Israeli state. Can you talk about that, the economic implications of what makes it almost impossible, at least for my reading, to transition into this two-state solution that's been talked about since Oslo, versus the economic viability of a one-state solution?
Yeah, I think we need to separate between what is the analysis of the possibilities and the actions, and what is the propaganda, because the billions of dollars, and it's actually tens of billions of dollars that Israel would be obligated to pay to the settlers in the West Bank is an amount of money that is completely manufactured. It has no basis in reality. It's just that they tried to create a precedent by
Yeah.
throwing money at the very small number of settlers that were withdrawn from Gaza, in order to make it impossible for ever withdrawing settlers from the West Bank.
Oh,
This was a trick. This
I
was a
see.
plan
I
to
see.
just put a number out there that is not realistic.
Yeah.
But this is because Israel is not choosing any kind of solution, not one state or two state or anything. This is not, from the Israeli point of view, the word solution is not appropriate here, because for the Israeli public, the solution, so to speak, is the status quo, apartheid. Why change anything? It's
Right.
working for them. Which means that it changes not in the moment in which the Israelis decide, let's find a more cost-effective way of living, or that it changes when the Palestinians are strong enough to force the Israelis to recognize Palestinian sovereignty, humanity, basic
Right.
human and political rights. So then, as an activist, I would say, these questions of what is the viability of a one state, two state, these questions are secondary.
Right.
Because first of all, the states are institutions that human beings establish for themselves. If humans want it to work, it will work. If a majority among Palestinians will say, what we want is two separate states, then it will happen. I don't think a majority among Palestinians are saying this, but it's not for me to tell them what to want.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Palestinians will decide their own future. And the Israelis have already decided, meaning that they've given up their ability to contribute to that decision by saying, what we want is, only Jewish sovereignty, apartheid in the entire Palestine. We just heard the Israeli Minister of Defense saying that Israel will establish a Jewish sovereignty in the West Bank as well,
Right.
in complete violation of international law, but also very clear declaration of the desire for apartheid and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. So there's no question about this. So yeah, it's clear that the Israelis have painted themselves into a corner, and now Palestinians have to choose their own future. And the majority of Palestinians are saying, we care about our rights. We want to live in freedom. We want to have justice. We want to have equality. And the question of where the border should be is not the highest priority.
Okay.
And has never been the highest priority for Palestinians. That's not the issue. But in the end, people decide on political institutions. They decide where the border would be. They decide on whatever formality they want to have, or like system of government best fits their desires. But the economic the real question that we need to ask the economists is, having made a decision, what are the best economic policies to support that decision, to
Right.
make it viable and prosperous?
I think really what I was getting at with the question, and tell me if I'm off base here, is that like the way that I view the discourse around the solution to the Israel-Palestine question is that the two-state solution, at least for like my entire life, has been touted as kind of like the moderate position, the moderate position that most people are, and the one-state solution was kind of associated with more of an extremist or like extremist left-wing influence. Like, for example, I know like Edward Said was calling for a one-state solution, and Avi Schleim for a time disagreed with him, and then Avi Schleim later came to the opinion that a one-state solution would be more moral. And I think a lot of times it's looked at in the moral lens of like what would be more moral, a two or a one-state solution. And I was kind of bringing up the economic situation that you posed about how potentially catastrophic it could be to actually enact the two-state solution, and how that could potentially just ruin the state of Israel financially. And then also you brought up that that was actually an intentional move, that they gave that compensation to the settlers in Gaza because then that would essentially make that level of compensation impossible for the far more settlers in the West Bank, correct?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that I wouldn't call the two-state solution the moderate option. I
Okay.
think it's more like the propaganda argument that was mainly needed by the West.
Right.
So how can they justify supporting an apartheid state and also claiming to be standing with international law? And the way to find to pay lip service,
Yeah.
it was to say we support two-state solutions. So you
Right.
hear it most from the most complicit European and North American governments that have been supporting Israel in a very one-sided way,
Right.
and and in order to justify it, they kept saying two-state solution, two-state solution, but
Right.
they never had any honest intention of supporting Palestinian statehood.
No. Yeah.
It's not like they recognize both Palestine and Israel as two states. No, they just recognize Israel and said we support two-state solution. So it's just empty words.
Right.
But I don't think that one state. I would also not call it a radical or an extremist idea.
I think that's how it's framed, though, by a lot of people.
Yeah, but I wouldn't, because this is like the South Africa.
Right. Just to go on record, I don't think that there's anything extreme, for me personally, anything extreme or controversial about a democratic state where everyone has equal rights. I don't find that at all, but I'm kind of talking to the broader public, or maybe I'm speaking from a Western perspective. The broader public of the West sees that as kind of like a more radical solution. But I'm sorry, I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, no, because the United States is in fact a kind of one-state solution, a federal state solution for a lot of states that were in a state of war with each other at some point. And Germany is also exactly the same thing.
Right.
A one-state solution. It was unified East and West Germany, which were in a state of war, and now it's one state. And the governments of these two countries are saying, "Oh, but Palestinians don't deserve the same thing."
That won't work.
But I do want to say something about the example you gave with Edward Said and Avi Schleim. Mm-hmm. Because as much as I respect and adore Avi Schleim very much, let's not forget that Edward Said was an indigenous Palestinian, and this was his land.
Right.
Avi Schleim came to this land as a colonizer, even though he never made a choice to make it.
I mean, he was 8 years old or 9 years old or something.
Yeah, exactly. And he came from Iraq, where Iraq actually revoked the citizenship of its Jewish citizens. So it wasn't like he didn't come as supported by an empire at his back, but this is always what happens with settler colonialism. Right. Also in the United States, a lot of people came to the United States, Europeans who came because they were persecuted in their home countries, and had nowhere else to go, but they still came as colonizers.
Right, regardless
which
of that.
Also still means that they don't get to tell the indigenous population what kind of political system they should have.
Right.
So Avi Schleim might have his opinion, of course. I have my opinion. That's perfectly allowed. But it's not up to us to listen to when will Avi Schleim change his opinion, and because in the end, it's Edward Said who makes the decision. Not, of course, he doesn't speak for all Palestinians.
Right.
But Palestinians are the ones as the indigenous population who decide what will happen.
100%.
Yeah.
I know we're getting towards the end of time here. Another question that I just wanted to ask, because again, I hear this so much in the media, and I was curious because I know you've written also quite a bit about the aid situation to the occupied Palestinian territories, and just something that I wanted to bring up to you. I just wanted to get your perspective on, because we hear this all the time from, I guess you could say, like Zionist or Zionist leaning media, where they say, hey, listen, look at all this millions or billions or however much it is money and aid that Gaza had received, and all they did was build tunnels. They just used it to build tunnels. They didn't do anything to enrich the enrich Gaza or anything like this. And I'm just kind of curious, what would your response be to people that point to that as some kind of way to disparage Palestinians living in Gaza?
Well, this is a racist argument. There's no possibility for economic development under occupation.
Right.
People, I mean, even before the genocide started, the Gaza Strip was already the world's biggest open air prison, in the sense that the population there had no right to export anything. So how can they make money? You know, it's an absurd idea. By turning them into aid consumers, not just in Gaza, also in the West Bank, this makes them dependent. This creates this empowers them. So Palestinians have always been saying, we don't want aid. What we want is freedom to earn our own living, and we have the ability, and they do have the ability. But aid is a necessity under a situation of siege, when people are not able to import and export, and they live in prison-like conditions. Then they depend on aid in the same way that prisoners depend on food to be brought into the prison. You know, they can't sustain themselves, and this goes back to what we were talking about before, about how the economy of the occupation has shifted and transformed, and whether it's profitable or not, because Israel has allowed aid to flow into the Palestinian territory and put a lot of pressure to keep it humanitarian aid and not development aid, because they profited from it, because it became a source of income for the Israeli economy, because they were the ones who provided the food items and the medicine and things that were bought with the aid money to the Palestinians, who cannot produce these things on their own. So this dependency was really a source of strength for the Israeli economy. Now, with Israel becoming so genocidal and actually stopping aid, stopping the trucks from entering Gaza, where people are starving to death every day, this is a situation that is, of course, an atrocity and a crime against humanity and part of a genocide. So, but after all these moral statements must be said, we can also find time to say, oh, and it's also something that is a change of policy in Israel in a way that they're no longer profiting from it. And I've just heard a quote from an Israeli potato farmer the other day, where he said, I have to throw away tons of potatoes because people are not buying it in Israel. And I can't believe that I'm throwing away tons of potatoes to the garbage when people are starving to death 20 minutes away from me.
Mm-hmm.
So this farmer, I don't know if he was, really seeing the humanity of Palestinians. On some level, the suffering of Palestinians did reach him.
Right.
On some level, he understand, but he was trying to make a desperate call to the Israeli public to say, look, it's not a rational economic policy. If we only open the checkpoints and allow the food to flow in, then it's also in our interest. We will be able to sell those potatoes, and it's good for the Israeli economy. But of course, we are now at a stage where this kind of argument has no strength anymore, because the Israelis are not planning how to save their economy. They've lost hope about saving their economy. They're really just trying to kill off all the Palestinians that they can.
Would you say that kind of dynamic that you're describing is kind of what like an illustration of your criticism of kind of like the I guess you could call it orthodox Marxist analysis of the of the occupation?
Well, the Marxist analysis of occupation is a whole story in itself, and I don't think we have
Right.
time to
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
open it
You're
up.
right. Yeah.
All I do think that most of my criticism has not been against the Marxist analysis, but mostly against the neoliberal or neoclassicist
Right.
interpretation. I do have criticism against the Marxist interpretation as well, but one thing has to be said is that the leftist economists who are trying to produce economic analysis, whether I disagree with some of the analysis on a scientific, analytical level, let's remember that this is research that is coming from a position of supporting humanity and supporting
Right.
international law and
Right.
seeing Palestinians as human beings. And so it may be a disagreement, on an
Yeah.
academic level.
Right. Right. Right.
The disagreement with the mainstream economists, with the people who actively profit from genocide, is also a moral disagreement. It
Right.
goes
I see what
much
you're
deeper
saying.
than the academic disagreement.
I see what you're saying. I know we're running out of time. There's just one last thing I want to ask you, and it goes back to the Boycott National Committee campaign. For anybody that's listening to this that wants to potentially get involved in the BDS movement or furthering the military embargo efforts, how would just an average person listening to this be able to get involved or contribute to that?
First thing is go on our website, bdsmovement.net, where you can see all the different campaigns. I think the best thing to do is to think what kind of campaign fits you specifically. Because if you are a member of a church, then we have campaigns within churches. If you're a student, we have academic campaigns on campuses. If you're interested, if you know that there's a military, an arms factory in your vicinity of your town, or maybe you live next to a port where weapons are being shipped, there will be a group which is organizing protests about this. So the best thing is to think what campaign you see yourself participating in. BDS has so many different options, and it works best, of course, if you choose a campaign that fits you rather than just,
Right.
see what's there on the top of the list.
Okay. All right. And just lastly, for anyone that's interested in more of your work, is there any place where people can follow you or keep up with the projects that you're working on?
I think it's best to follow the BDS movement. It's
Okay.
also on social media, on Instagram, on Facebook, on X, on I'm sure I'm forgetting something now. Blue Sky. So yeah, it's possible to follow the BDS movement, and if I'm writing something about the military embargo campaign, that's
It'll
where
be
you'll see it. Yeah.
Okay, well, fantastic. Well, Shir, thank you so much for coming on and speaking with us today. It was a really, really educational conversation, and I'm really, really appreciative that you took the time to come in here and speak to us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So don't run around here trying to make friends with somebody who's depriving you of your rights. They're not your friends. No, they're your enemies. And treat them like that and fight them, and you'll get your freedom. My repertoire is USSR. Be a low style, be a low style, got thrown out the car. Rise with subversive plots. They'll call you an extremist or subversive or red radical. Rise with subversive plots. Red radical. And fight them. Capitalism and democracy. Capitalism and democracy are not synonymous. We do what's up like ants in a colony.